there. I'll take your questions. 636-686-0140. Should we really celebrate the Reformation, or should we grieve that God's church is so fractured? I would say yes. It's a great question, it really is. Because, and I can just say this, part of the intention of the reformers, and they were not perfect people, and you read some of Martin Luther's stuff, especially later in life, and all of the fight and the war and the bitterness and all of the things that were inflicted upon him, it got to him in a very negative way. And so over time, he became bitter, and he said some really, really awful things. But the original intention was not to splinter the church or fracture the church. The original intention was to guide the church back to truth, not to create new churches. Unfortunately, that is what happened. And so yeah, we should absolutely grieve that the church is fractured. But we should also celebrate that the gospel has been restored and that it's been made clear, and that some people, boldly gave their lives to say, hey, the truth of God is that he's gracious and we are reconciled to him by faith, and the scriptures teach us that, and it's all about Jesus, it's not about us. We should be grateful that there were people who taught that, because that's part of what we have today, and without them, we'd be lost. So it's both. It's absolutely both. We should celebrate the Reformation, but this is why here, we're not too caught up in all of the heritage sides of the Reformation. It's great. We're more caught up in the side that the idea that we are people of the gospel. We are heirs of the gospel truth that was just brought back to light during the Reformation, but it's actually a scriptural gospel truth. It's not about some weird cultural thing that happened 500 years ago. And hopefully, God will continue to bring his church back together. I think that's maybe even what's happening here in America. Are there any places in Scripture that prescribe what worship should look like for the church? Great question. This word prescribe, just like you get a prescription, this is, when you use the word prescribe, that's saying, hey, this is how it must be. And throughout the Bible, throughout the Old Testament, there's a lot of prescription about what worship should look like. In the New Testament, you get some descriptions of how people worshiped, but you don't get much in the way of prescription of saying, this is how worship should look like. You should start with this kind of prayer, and then you should sing 2 songs, and then you should. But there are some prescriptions about more of what the substance of worship should be. Again, it should be focused on Jesus as the object of our salvation. Worship should be something that brings us together. We shouldn't, there's a lot in 2 Corinthians about how we shouldn't be arrogant or proud with each other in worship, how wealthy people shouldn't get better treatment in worship, how we should truly treat each other as brothers and sisters in worship. And so there's a lot prescribed about our attitudes towards one another. But in terms of, liturgies or formats or music or how we do that, no, we should honor God, we should glorify God, we should be focused on Jesus, rooted in the scriptures, and that's enough. Now, a lot of people will argue from a point of tradition that things should look a certain way because it's good practice, but that's not actually biblical. How do you get your children to care about important landmarks in their growth in faith, like confirmation, when the church downplays it too much? Oh, this is a great question. A little bit of bite there. You're feisty. I like it. So let's just clarify something. Confirmation, it's not in the Bible. You know that? Not in the Bible. Doesn't exist. Do we know that? So what's the point of confirmation? The point of confirmation is someone along the way thought it would be a good idea for kids, and again, we're talking about a practice that developed out of Europe, that kids in Europe, everyone in Europe was baptized as a baby. Whether you were a faith-filled family or not, you were baptized. Just kind of what you did. So you're baptized as a baby in Europe. In Middle Ages Europe and medieval Europe, you were baptized. And so someone said, hey, it'd be a good idea for all these kids who are baptized, for them to actually understand their faith at some point. And because they were kind of a ritualistic church, not a literate church, they didn't have a lot of opportunities. They created a structure for people to come to, at a certain age, to learn about their faith, and then to stand up and say, hey, all of that stuff that God gave me in baptism, his claim on me, all of those things that my parents said yes to and said, yeah, we'll raise our kids to know Jesus and to know his life and to be, his grace. I'm gonna take a moment where I say, yeah, I affirm that. I want that for my life. And so there was a practice of confirmation. So confirmation is not biblical, it's not sacred, it grew out of a cultural context, and yet we still think it can be a valuable thing for kids. Here's where it can be not valuable though. When confirmation becomes a thing that you do because you get in 8th grade and it's what everyone else is doing. That's not the purpose or the intention at all. The purpose or the intention is that kids have an opportunity in their faith at some point to stand, and it's gonna happen at different moments for kids, but to stand up and say, I profess Jesus, because Jesus says, if you profess me before men, I will profess you before my Father in heaven. If you deny me before men, I'll deny you before my Father in heaven. A profession is an important part of all of this. So I love what we're doing right now as a church. Part of our student ministry, our core experience for middle schoolers, what happened even before that in nursery and preschool and children, all the children's ministry phases, kids are learning about Jesus in such powerful ways. They're learning about God's character. They're not just memorizing stuff. They're getting to know who God is, and they're learning to trust him, and their hearts are being inclined to follow him. And so for me, I don't care where it happens. I don't care where in their life. They could be 8 years old, they could be 20 years old, they could be 40 years old. I don't care where in their life, but what I see happening at this church is that kids are understanding who God is, and more out of a desire, out of a response of what God has done for them and an understanding what that is, they're saying, yes, God, I wanna follow you. I wanna live according to your kingdom. I wanna serve Jesus with my life. And it's a powerful and beautiful thing. So much more biblical than just going through some sort of ritual because you're in 8th grade and that's the thing that everyone else is doing, right? That's not biblical at all. The 3 solas, by grace alone, faith alone, and scripture alone, seems like such an easy concept from the early church. So why do we have these televangelists who believe in the same God as you and me, preaching the prosperity gospel? How come they and others, so-called churches, don't get it? Yeah, and I mean, that's frustrating to me too. Let me just say this quickly. The bottom line is there are moments where we all don't get it, right? We all make it more complicated than it needs to be. There's something about our humanity that fights against grace. We want to be able to do it on our own. We want credit for our relationship with God. We want to be able to brag about it. We want to say we're better than others. We want to make it more complicated than faith and trust. We want to show God that we're impressive. We want to show people that we're impressive. We have a hard time submitting to wisdom that we don't understand in the scriptures. We want to figure it out ourselves. We want to follow our own wisdom. That's stuff we all do, isn't it? We all do that. And if you, this is a continuum kind of thing that we all struggle with it. It's the same thing we all struggle with. Some people just get further down the road of rebelling against those things, like we all do. They get further down the road than others. Those things go unchecked, so they end up in a worse place and they bring damage to the church. But these are some fundamental urges that we all fight against. And I think that's why we have to be humble. We have to ask the question, so what am I really a part of? And not only do we have to ask ourselves that, but we surround ourselves with a community of people who will help us to stay rooted in what's true and good and right. You said that the Reformation came because the church was off track. How do we know that changes happening here are on track and the true church? Again, humbly, I would say there's always a part of us that doesn't know. We believe that's true. And the reason we believe that's true is because we're guided by Scripture. We're preaching Jesus. We're living by grace alone. We're teaching the necessity of faith and nothing else. And so these are very biblical concepts, as the question before said, and we're just living out those concepts. And so because of that, because we're following the scriptures, because we're living according to these really basic fundamental things that existed as a part of God's relationship with his people from all the way from Abraham. I mean, all the way from Adam and Eve, really, if you go all the way back, we think we're on the right track. But you know what? We should always be humble, because the moment we think we've got it, the moment we're proud, the moment we think, yeah, we're on it. Everyone else is messed up, but we're great. That's the moment pride comes in, and that's where you end up off track. And I can just tell you, as one of your leaders, as your senior pastor, for me, there's an incredible amount of humility that goes into this. There's an incredible amount of scriptural guidance. There's an incredible amount of prayer. There's an incredible amount of counsel from other wise and biblical people to try to ensure that we never go off track. And for me personally, the moment that the grace of Jesus stops doing something to my heart, the moment I stop being overwhelmed by the kindness of God and what he's done for the world, but what he's done also for me, the moment that happens, I think we're all doomed. But so until then, that's something that I take very seriously, is understanding my brokenness, the way that I fall short. That's just not pastor talk. I'm very truly, completely broken, just like the rest of you. And that's why what Jesus has done, it's life-changing for me. And that's why his love and his favor and his grace, that's why it's so powerful in my life. And as long as we're rooted around that, as long as we know who we are by nature and who God has called us to be, and we live according to grace and faith and let the scriptures guide us, and we stay focused on Jesus and giving God glory and letting the Spirit fill this church and inviting the Spirit in to fill this church, I think we're gonna be okay. But it always requires humility, a willingness to die to ourselves. Because out of death, God brings life.